So yeah, I'm excited to read your story. I was sharing it with my husband, just that snippet. And he was like, this is really cool.
What
I'm
you
like,
mean
I
that
know.
stuff on the jacket?
Yeah, on Amazon. It lists like, all your credentials, that you are a child of Holocaust survivors.
Mm-hmm.
It goes into this whole thing. And I'm like, I want to read the rest of it to actually hear your story. But I'm partially happy I didn't read it because I like to get to know you now and
Sure
who you
thing.
are now and what got you here.
I'm happy to be here and I'm open to whatever you want to talk about.
Ready? 3,
3, 2.
I can't use the middle finger this time. I'm sorry. We normally do the 3, 2, and then we flip each other off for the 1, but I wasn't ready. Yes, but I'm not flipping off. It just doesn't feel right. Okay, ready? 3, 2, 1. Welcome back to another episode of Shit That Goes On in Our Heads. I'm Dirty Skittles, and I'm joined with G-Rex, and our guest today is Jackie. Welcome to our podcast, Jackie. How are you doing today?
Fine. Thanks for having me. I'm thrilled to be here. I'm good.
I cannot wait to just hear who you are now. So who is Jackie today?
Jackie today is a happily retired wife, mother, grandmother, a friend, and doctor still. I mean, as far as, I guess I'm more of an author and I'm a doctor more in my head because I don't practice anymore, but that's those are the hats I wear. I have other things, hobbies and things, but I am trying to negotiate having written this book and getting the word out there. I have my voice. I don't think I'm an expert at anything really specific, but I'm working on getting my thoughts out there and seeing if I can help a few people. It seems like I have. So that's motivating me. That's where I'm at. I wrote this book, wasn't planning on it, but it seems to be well received and people are liking it and resonating with it in some way. There's something there for most people, it seems. And that's very rewarding and surprising. I wasn't expecting that.
And the book is called Yesterday Never Sleeps.
Yes, Yesterday Never Sleeps. How integrating life's current and past connections improves our well-being. That means a lot of different things.
Yeah. I mean, just that line itself, when I was reading up on that before we started recording, I reflected on my own journey. And something about that line that you just said reminds me of I was in therapy for over a year. But my biggest takeaway, and I guess like aha moment in that, was acknowledging my past, but really identifying what those feelings were. And there was something freeing once I did that, because I knew I didn't have to keep living in the past, right? Like I went back there, I acknowledged it for what it was. I came to an understanding of what happened in my childhood, and I don't have to carry that with me every day.
Well, we live in the past when we're either traumatized by it or don't understand it. I mean, we really should live in the moment. And if we're resolved with the past and understand it and are connected to it, then we should be able to have peace of mind and live in the moment and enjoy the moment and be fully present. The important things from the past that we haven't resolved, they'll find us. We don't need to go looking for them. And if we're stuck living in the past, then there are things we have to resolve. So, I mean, that's my bent. That's what I try to explain. That's what I try to teach people. And that's what my life's work's been pretty much, as a psychiatrist and as a psychoanalyst. And as someone who's board certified in neurology too. I mean, I really have a biopsychosocial model of life. I mean, my model of the mind is based on the body and the social cultural aspect of one's life, the way you're placed in the world, what your surroundings like, who your social life is, who you work with, and what your support systems are. And your body and your mind and your brain are all connected, and your soul and your spirit, they're all connected and they're not to be separated.
Yeah. How did that journey and that passion start for you?
Well, it started really because I was a little kid. I was a child of people that were terribly traumatized. My parents had terrible PTSD. They were Holocaust survivors who emigrated to the United States. I mean, I was the first American born in my family, and they lived in Europe for a long time, migrating kind of as nomadically. And there's nothing redeeming about the Holocaust. It was a horrible thing, but there's something about being the child of these people that gave me a reference point to appreciate life and to appreciate what I had. And that my parents were very grateful to be alive, and they were very mindful people. They could think about things and they could think about how they felt. And, when something seemed off the wall and out of context, and I'll give you some examples, they were able to explain things in a way that made sense for me out of things that seemed nuts. Kind of like Marilyn Munster in the Munsters, how everyone thought there was something wrong with her, but she was kind of really the normal one. But my parents were very good at pointing things out. And I think I gave you some examples last time we spoke. So, for example, my father would hug us really tightly, and he'd hug me very tightly to the point where I'd feel like, oh, that hurts. And so he'd often cry while he was looking at me. And after, when I was old enough, about 6 or 7, maybe 5, I said, why, what did I do wrong? Because children are by nature, they're narcissistic. Everything's about them. And if something goes wrong, it's about them too. And so he'd say to me, no, you didn't do it. I'd say, what did I do? He'd say, you didn't do anything. I love you so much that you look like one of my sisters, exactly like her. And the Nazis killed her. And so I'm sad sometimes when I see your face. I think of her. And this is a common thing. This is not just, this happens to a lot of people. They see their kid and it reminds them of their ex-husband. And then it's hard for them to be nice to their kid because they're mad at their ex-husband. So that kind of thing happens too. But the fact that he could reflect and explain that to me made me I felt sad for him. I felt sorry for him. And I was sympathetic. And that's how you become empathetic. You become empathetic when people treat you well. And when your parents can explain things and they can say they're sorry and they can mend repairs when they do something wrong. So I had that benefit. I also got screwed up in certain ways from being a child of these people. But so that got me into I call it a thinking state of mind, metacognitive, meaning not just being, but thinking about how you feel. And if you can label your emotions and think about them and put words to imagery, then you can recover from trauma. Then you can have a place for things that are just kind of floating around in your psyche. And the problem with trauma often is that the visual and the words do not go together with the experience. It's often in the body. And connecting all of them really is grounding and is really good for your brain too, because it makes all kinds of connections that are very good for the brain itself as far as, higher cognitive function, as far as like being rational and reasonable and having good reality testing and being able to have forethought and sequence things and have good judgment, like all the things that make people good at what they're doing and, and have agency and be empowered. So those things are very important. So I had the benefit of being able to think that way.
Yeah. I think selfishly, as I'm listening to you, as a parent, there was a very scary moment. I remember my son was very young. I think he was probably like 2, maybe 3. And he's always been pretty vocal and he'll ask a lot of questions always. And I don't remember what was happening, but I was having a really bad day. And it must have been written on my face. I don't hide my emotions very well, the face. And I remember him asking me like, Mommy, are you okay? Did I do something like what you're saying? And I remember being scared, thinking, should I be honest with him? Because I don't necessarily need to tell him exactly what it is, because it could be an adult type of concept that he's not going to understand. But I remember making the decision at that moment to be honest with my emotions. Like, Mommy's not having a happy day today, and Mommy's got a lot of things on her mind, or, trying to find a way to explain it to him. So I knew it wasn't him, but I also, the reason why it was scary for me was because I wanted him to at least know what my emotions meant. And I wasn't sure if that was the right decision, right? Like I was like, because my parents never did that with me. So I'm like, do I do this? Do I be honest with him and tell him if I'm happy, if I'm sad, if I'm mad, and what in a general sense is causing it? And you never know, right? Is that the right call? You're a parent. You don't know. There's not a book that tells you how to do these things, but kind of going off of that
there is an
instinct.
answer. There is an answer that unless you're beating your kid up and you're abusing them or you're neglecting them and starving them and locking them in a closet and doing terrible things to them, there's no right or wrong answer. So any way that you interact with your child, if it doesn't go over well, you can always fix it. You can always correct it. You can always, because kids are resilient and they bounce back very quickly. If they know that you love them, and that's another thing. My parents loved me they loved me, and it was clear they loved their children, even though they made mistakes. You get over things when you're well loved and when you're nurtured and you're basically taken care of well enough, consistently enough, and you're not withdrawn from, and you don't have a parent with erratic behavior. Your son knows you love him. And the truth is, with kids and adults too, if people don't want to know anymore, if they've had enough, if that's all they can tolerate emotionally, because they're starting to get overwhelmed, their emotions are overwhelmed, they can't modulate them, they can't regulate them, they stop asking questions. So he asked you, and understand that beneath every question, beneath every behavior, there's something psychically, emotionally going on. So he asked you because he was self-referential. He thinks you're upset, you're mad at him that he did something wrong.
Right.
So you can explain to him, as you did, mommy's not having a good day. It has nothing to do with you. And that's it. How can that be the wrong thing to say? If you went on to give him gory details, and that's not cool. I mean, that's not necessary. And then he'd say stop. He'd cover his ears. He'd go, or he'd run away, or he'd start engaging in something else. He'll let you know he doesn't need to know anymore.
Yeah.
So it's like when children ask, "Mommy, where did I come from?" and they're 2 years old, you say you came from mommy and daddy, and they're fine with that. But by the time they're 3, they want to know, how did I come from mommy and daddy? And this happened with one of my kids too. Well, how did they come? Mommy and daddy got together and they made a baby together. That's okay for a 3-year-old. By the time they're 4 or 5, they want to know how they did it. And they keep asking until they're satisfied. And you tell them the birds and the bees when you're 18, that doesn't go over too well. It doesn't go over too well when you start school. Kids know what's going on. So, it's so those kinds of things. I mean, you just use your judgment, and you can't go wrong. As long as you can repair ruptures in any relationship, you learn how to argue well. You learn if you're well attached, if you're well connected, if you're in sync, if you're attuned to your child, and you make a mistake or you go ballistic or you lose your cool, you're human, and they need to understand that.
Yeah.
And that's how they develop empathy too.
Yeah, we have that in our house. Like when we sit for dinner, we'll talk about, was today a good day or a bad day? And we just kind of go round robin. Like, did you have a good day today? Was it a bad day? Were there happy moments, sad moments? And it's just worked out. Like now he's 6 and he will tell you exactly how he feels. And he's really good at identifying that. And for me, that's a success because I don't think I learned. Yeah, I was like, I don't think I learned that till like last year. Really, honestly, like going back and coming to grips with my past, but also understanding and taking a moment. I think that's what it was. I was taking the time to identify what I was feeling. And I hadn't done that.
You have to do that. It's very important because if you don't know what you're feeling, we're going to put stuff on other people and get very mixed up very quickly.
Yeah.
And our mental states affect our perceptions.
They sure do. That was one of the things I learned early on in therapy was, just reflecting on what I'm feeling and being truthful with myself. And the other thing I really learned is just to let go of my past, right? Like I can't go back. I can't change it. And I'm a happier person because I'm not carrying that garbage with me anymore. And for me, it was a lot of garbage.
Yeah. Learning you don't have to carry it. That was huge.
Well, I wonder what letting go means. What does it mean to you to let go?
It doesn't consume me. So right before I had my mental breakdown in 2022, I was just holding all that in and I wouldn't let any of it go, right? And people were holding it against me, like they would see me as I was 14, 15 years ago versus where I am now. And I just stopped caring what they thought. And for me, that was the most freeing thing in the world because I just don't care because I know who I am and I know what I've done and I know what I've accomplished. And I know in my heart I'm a good person. Maybe 14, 15 years ago, when I was still trying to figure out life, maybe I might have had some things going on. But for now, I'm free of that burden. I don't carry it anymore. And I'm a much happier person because of it. Because I see myself the way others around me see me. And that's big for me because, I spent years beating myself up. So,
Well, having your self perception toggle with your social persona and the way people actually perceive you is very good. That's great. Most people have a different sense of themselves and the way they're perceived. That's okay too. But I think the most important thing is that if you were feeling unwell and you had what you would call a breakdown, that you got well and whatever it took for you to do that. We talked about this a little bit last time
yeah,
because I really feel like there's no glory in suffering at all. And
man,
unfortunately, there's still stigma with mental health problems, with brain problems, as I call them, because people unfortunately think that you're doing things willfully, that you're not pulling yourself up you're not trying hard enough. We're not pulling ourselves up by our bootstraps. And that is the most ridiculous thing. I thought those days would be long gone by now. And they're
Mm-hmm.
not. People still think it's your fault, and people are
Yeah.
self-blaming about being ill. And,
Mm-hmm.
mental illness is brain body illness. It's just like diabetes is. You have high blood sugar because your insulin's not working properly, or you have high blood pressure because you have genetic high blood pressure. We don't blame people that have cancer, do we? No,
Right.
because we know that's something that is genetically driven or environmentally driven. You can't do that much about getting it. But when it comes to mental health problems, and I don't like calling them mental health because it sounds like it's something we can control readily. And there's a lot we can do to help ourselves, but some things just are biochemical, biological, and we're in an age of molecular genetics where one of these years you're going to be able to check to have a sensor that'll tell you you're low in brain adrenaline, you're low in brain cortisol, you're low in GABA, you're low in serotonin, and
Mm-hmm.
and you need to adjust the ratio. And so you'll give yourself a little bit of whatever it is, vitamin Prozac, and, and in fact, I mean, even 150 years ago, Sigmund Freud knew. He was a neuroscientist. He knew that all this stuff would be explained on a molecular level someday. But he said, until then, we need a way to converse about what's going. We need a way. We need to taxonomize. We need to classify these things. We need to know. We need to have a way to talk about things, in a standardized way. And he wrote, 26 volumes. A lot of the theories are kind of, not fashionable or incorrect, but he had the technical principles and he had a model of the mind that's still relevant, still very valid about the unconscious versus the conscious mind, and how the unconscious is really a huge part of our brain and our mind and our functioning. And people just are afraid to go there. It's like a neighborhood they don't want to visit.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a shame because if we know ourselves, our deep structures, our deep wants, because that's where the deepest fears, longings, desires, that's where they reside. And if we're not in touch with them at all, they're gonna trick us. They're gonna deceive us. And that's why people are self-deceptive, you know.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's important, Rose. I think it's important to know that you can change too, right? Like who you are or who you were, 5 years ago
Absolutely.
evolves and continues to develop into somebody that you could be today. And one of my least favorite questions is when people ask me, like, who are you today? Or because I don't know who I am yet, Like I think I was afraid to admit that for a while. And I'm like, no, I'm still working on that. Like I'm still processing and thinking of who I am today. Like I know I'm a mom, I know I'm a wife, I know I am a boss, right? But like there's more to me than those
We're
labels.
always evolving and we're always connecting the dots in our life, in our history, and to our ancestry too. I mean, if you have a self story and you can think divergently, if you can make connections because you have an understanding of your history and of the past, then you have good judgment and you have all kinds of ways you can think about things. You're not stuck in the same stale stale responses, same way of looking at something. And that's rigid, that's black or white.
Mhm.
You live in a whole gray zone, and you can make all kinds of answers and explanations for things that go on in your life.
Yeah.
That's what therapy does. I mean, therapy does, I had a patient, Barbara, who didn't know why she was rejected by it. She'd go on a date. A guy would never call her back. She didn't know why. She was attractive. She had a reasonable job. She was a nice person. She didn't know what happened. They'd say she's controlling. They say she didn't know. She didn't know why. She didn't know what was wrong, but she came to therapy because she wanted to not be rejected. She wanted to be accepted. She wanted love in her life. And usually, we tell our patients, they understand the framework, 15 minutes, and this is what the charge is, and this is when we're going to meet. You have a framework for working together.
Mhm.
You have an operating kind of agreement or understanding. So they can't take things personally. Like if you have to stop the session, they're in the middle of a story and you can't really go on for another 20 minutes, right? So here we are in the first session. She's very open. She's telling me, very trusting with her new doctor. And she's very good storyteller, good historian. And then after 47 minutes, 48 minutes, I said, we have to wrap it up. And she went off me about, oh, of course you don't want to hear what I say. Of course you have better things to do. Of course you want to get rid of me. And, I knew at that point that I put that on the back burner. I just calmed her down a little bit, but that's important data. And I said to myself, okay, this is important because this is a script. This is an automatic script that's in her head. That's probably an old story of being rejected, of being not being considered, of being low person on the totem pole, and of not being thought of fondly
Mhm.
and importantly. And of course, that came up over and over again. That's called transference. When your
Mhm.
patient lays their stuff on you, that's what happens. And so I call those automatic mental constructs, these kind of patterns of behavior and of thinking based on your inner beliefs, based on your inner relationships, the way you've been treated over and over again. They get internalized, they get ossified. And then we have these trigger reactions. And they could be, that's really a problem. So she finally learned that was going on in her head, and she was able to figure out why she was that way. So learning about why we are the way we are is a lifelong process. We're always evolving, we're always changing. And even
Yeah.
when you're telling your story, you might make connections. And
Mhm.
that's very good to be creative thinking that way about what could this mean? What's this about? And so I propose that in any given day for people that aren't used to this, that as you do, you check in with yourself, especially when there are transitions in the day, like you just got to work or you just got home before you shift and put a different hat on. I suggest you check in with yourself and say, what am I feeling? What am I feeling in my chest? What am I feeling in my guts? How does my head feel? Am I nervous? Am I calm? I'm nervous. Take a deep breath. Take a few deep breaths. Focus on your breath because we can control our breath. We can control our nervous system through our breath. We can't control our nervous system with our pulse, through our heart rate, through our blood pressure. We can't, but we can control our breath. We can calm down the autonomic nervous system that puts out cortisol and adrenaline and makes us fight or fly. And that's important. So you check in with your body and you identify your feelings, and then you can think about, okay, why am I nervous? I'm going home. I'm going to see my family. Why am I anxious? And as you
Mhm.
said before, you think about it, Charlene. You think about it, you
Yeah.
get a grip, and then you go on and you don't do stupid things that you're going to regret.
Yeah.
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 So, so true. Like all things that like my therapist talked to me about too is, just like you said, check in with yourself 3 or 4 times during the day. And I do that. So when I get up in the morning, I check in. Did I sleep well? Do I feel refreshed? Have I talked to Dirty Skittles today? Because I make it a habit. I talk to her. I try to talk to her every day. Midday. Okay. Have I eaten? Do I feel okay? Am I ready to get on this call? And then when I get ready to leave the office, I'm like, I want to leave all that here, right? I don't want to go through the French doors and take it out to the rest of the family. My stuff is my stuff. And it's been working really well for me. My wife said that I'm like a totally different person now.
Right. That's a great way of life. And to me, that's the most important habit that anyone can form in their life is to be able to talk to themselves or be a fly on the wall. Or I think I said something like the Truman Show, watch what you're watching a reality show of yourself all day long. In some level, you have an inner wise person. You talk to yourself and you ask yourself and you think about how you feel. And doing that is incredibly important. Because if you can do that, then if you're self-reflective, if you're introspective, you go in and you know how you feel and you go up to your brain and you think about how you feel. That there's no better skill to develop as far as connection, as far as attachment, as far as becoming an empathetic person and becoming a kinder human being. It all
Yeah.
starts at home with the parent and the child. And then it all becomes about you being able to know yourself and keep the other person in mind as having an independent, separate center of initiative, having their own mind and being able to keep that in mind at the same time as you're being yourself. And it's not that hard to do. I mean, most kids that grow up in a good enough environment learn how to, we call that mentalizing. Mentalizing is an exchange where you can think about yourself and know how the other person's doing and feeling at the same time. And it involves certain qualities, like you have to be curious, you have to be attuned, you have to listen, things like that. And it's very important for good attachments, for good relationships that are healthy.
Yeah. What is one of the, if you can go back to think when you were growing up, what was one of the biggest lessons you learned from your parents as a child?
One of the biggest lessons I learned? Well, I learned from my father that connecting to ancestry is very important. Having connection to your past is very important, especially in my situation where a whole generation was wiped out. It was important to know that the people in my family before that were vibrant. That we weren't just victims, that we had a world that we lived in. And it was important for me to understand my family history because when you understand that you're rooted, it gives you a sense of rootedness. It gives you a sense of connection outside of yourself. Today, too many people and kids are just my life, me. They don't feel connected to the rest of the world. Some of it's kind of an existential issue, but when you realize you're just one small person and you're connected to a world and you're connected to a history before you, it's very humbling. And humility is very important because humility is kind of the flip side of gratitude. When you realize you're a speck, and I don't mean it in a denigrating way, but I mean you're important, but in the scheme of things, there's a big world, a big universe out there. It's very grounding and it's very rooting. It's kind of like thinking the trees that you see when you look down from an airplane, you see the trees and you see a forest. You think those treetops that's what you see, that's what there is. But you don't realize how those roots underground are connected and interconnected and what goes on. So many things go on that we're not aware of, that we don't see. And I think it's very, very important to have that vision, to have that understanding. It gives you an appreciation for your life. So I learned that from my father because my father was a very unusually interesting man. He was so capable, but he was doubly orphaned by the time he was 7. Both parents were gone. He grew up on the street, basically. He was homeless. And he had 2 sisters that helped him, but he basically, if it weren't for the kindness of strangers, he wouldn't have survived childhood. And he was basically a street urchin. And then the war came and he was running from the Nazi. He's running like a wild person, crazy person, running for 2.5 years, not knowing whether he was going to survive the next 5 minutes or not. And so he had a lot of difficult circumstances. And he taught me, and he didn't have a picture of him. He never saw a photograph of himself. He didn't know his birthday. He didn't even know, what he looked like. He didn't know what he looked like as a child. He never saw himself in a mirror. This kind of thing was just shocking to me. And it made me feel like, oh my God, I have to know my history. I have to know who I am. I mean, how do you know who you are if you don't even know what you look like as a little kid? How do you have any sense of continuity? But he managed, and that affected me hugely. And so that's one thing I learned from them. Be connected, and it actually is borne out in neuroscience that connection to ancestry is very important. The kids that are like, I've talked about, this is a case I really like. the kids that survived Hurricane Katrina. Remember that about 20 years ago? But the kids that survived Hurricane Katrina, those that were connected to their grandparents, who knew where they were from, who knew where they worked, who knew their story. As teenagers, they developed more autonomy, more independence. It was easier for them to separate, individuate. They had agency. They were empowered. They were empowered. The kids who had roots, who felt like they were part of something, they were more empowered. And that continues. That's borne out across history, across current history, present times. So that's what I learned from my dad. From my mother, I learned my mother was a very happy person. My mother was a very self-assured person. She was very confident, and she had a very difficult situation to live with because she was a heroine. She saved her family, but she also was pawned off. She saved them because she was pawned off to sleep with an officer who had the hots for her. And so she had a double-edged thing because she was, in those days in small towns in Europe, that was like damaged goods. You're supposed to be a virgin when you get married. And so she was damaged goods, but she was also the savior. And that was a tough thing for her to deal with. But I learned from her because she became a motivational speaker. She wrote her memoir. She wrote 2 books. One was for kids that was a bestseller. She had a movie that Richard Gere narrated, a documentary. She was a public speaker, and she was a motivational speaker. And she taught me that, this kind of hatred and terror that you survive does not have to turn you into a terrible person. It doesn't have to make you have unmitigated anger and hatred, but she rose from that. And I'm not saying good things came of it, but she focused. She didn't capitulate to despair. I learned from her that you can do good things. You can be a good person. You can help the world. And you can use what you've learned. You can use your suffering to help other people deal with their suffering. And that was a big lesson. And I try to follow in her footsteps. You learn from your hardships and you help other people overcome theirs by telling your story. As said earlier, your role is to help other people not feel lonely, not feel alone, and know that there's other people that go through that. This is a human condition. It's hard to be human. It's really hard. And we're all doing it, but we all have our own paths, but we can help each other with things that we know about that we can shed some light on.
Yeah. That's exactly what I was thinking of. I'm like, man, that's the goal, right? It's to me.
It's very achievable. It's very achievable. Easier for some people. Not everybody has the easiest circumstances, but it's very achievable to keep hope alive and to not to capitulate to despair and to find ways to overcome yourself, to overcome. And the thing is, if you've been traumatized, and I don't mean by like an accident, I mean, if you've been victimized, if you don't know about it, if you don't get it, you become a perpetrator. And it's a very harsh statement, but I feel very strongly that's an important one. If you don't know what happened to you, you end up doing the same thing to other people, and it becomes generational. And as much as you love your kids or you love your spouse or you love your friends, you become an implementer of the things that you're trying to get away from. And I can give you 2 quick examples that'll resonate. It'll make sense of what I'm trying to say. One of them's chapter 2 in my book. It's about a woman in a boutique who called the police on me. She called 911 because she thought I had a gun. And she was terrified. And the police came in an hour later and they surrounded me and they asked me what was in my pocket. And I put my hand down reflexively and they drew their guns and I got frisked and it freaked me out. It was terrifying. And bottom line is this woman, and her judgment was so impaired because she profiled me, which is not a cool thing to do anyway, but she was twice my size. She was half my age. I was with a toddler, for God's sake. She was a little kid. And, I did not look like someone that was going to rob her store. And so she had poor judgment. And when the police came, I said, this is crazy. I mean, this woman's either psychotic, she's mentally ill, she's having a delusion, or she suffered gun trauma. And it was the latter. She had a hair trigger response, knee-jerk response. She didn't think about her terror. And she called the police, and she made me feel the way she felt when she saw a gang shooting when she was a kid. I felt the same way, like they're going to kill me. They could, easily pull the gun and pull the trigger and shoot me, you know?
Yeah.
So that there's an example. That's a very good example. Anyway, that's an example. I don't
Yeah.
need to give you another one, but that's the idea. That's the idea. Poor judgment. And she was a nice person. When she found out that I was just a regular person, she was mortified. I mean, they watched an hour of camera footage on this, and she
Wow.
was horrified. She was a nice person, but she created a situation. She made me as scared as she was.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, I get it. So we talked about the biggest lesson you learned from your parents. What has been the hardest lesson you've learned throughout your life and your journey,
The
your
hardest, well, that's a
experiences?
good question. I never thought about things in terms of the hardest thing because I don't like to bottom line things like that so much. But the hardest thing for me, because I've thought about this in giving talks about these kinds of things, and the hardest thing, which actually has made me more resilient, is dealing with opposites, dealing with extremes that don't make sense, dealing with paradoxes and paradigms that don't make sense, incongruencies. So, for example, I'm a child of survivors. And as a child of survivors, or this is true for refugees, immigrants, people fleeing situations, you know, whether they're natural disasters or actually, no, not so much natural disaster. Although now with climate change, people are getting really much more afraid and out of control about what's going on in their environment. But basically, um, when you're running from persecution, when you're running from, and most man-made cataclysms are genocides and they're man-made social cataclysms. I'm not talking about COVID or natural disasters, hurricanes, earthquakes, and infections, pandemics, but man-made cataclysm, social oppression. When you're running from persecution, you don't take anything with you. You put everything in your head. And when you're running from persecution, you try to make yourself very small and invisible, right? So kids like us that grew up, kids like me, we were told not to belong to groups, not to join groups, not to sign petitions, don't vote, don't go anywhere where you become a public, don't, God forbid, don't go online. You'll get Googled, they'll find you, it's that kind of
Right.
stuff. So on the one hand, you're supposed to be invisible, make yourself small. And I actually didn't even know how to spell my name till I was in third grade. I think that was partly my parents' unconscious motivation to not let me be on the radar in any way. But basically, keep yourself small and invisible under a rock. But on the other hand, if you're a child of survivors like this, they have so much guilt for having survived when everyone else died. There has to be a reason they survived, and the reason is their children, the hope for the future. So on the one hand, I'm supposed to be under a rock and be invisible. On the other hand, you're supposed to win a Nobel Prize or be famous or do something that makes their life worthwhile. So that's a crazy dialectic. It's impossible. So I've been under a rock. That's why I'm like, I hate social media. I don't like being on any of that stuff. Part of it's this kind of anxiety I have about being out there. And when I was writing the book, I'm like, I don't think, I mean, I was encouraged to do it because I got good feedback. And I'm like, well, no one's going to read it. So, but what if someone does read it? What if it becomes something? I can't be out there, So
Right.
that's a very hard thing for me. And there are a lot of things like that. Like I mentioned, my mother was like a Hester Prynne. She had a scarlet letter on her forehead saying, I'm not a virgin, which makes me, in those days, in her part of the world,
Right.
in Poland in the 1920s, 30s, that was damaged goods. That was not cool. And so on one hand, she's like considered almost a slut,
Mhm.
because women got trashed for using their bodies to save people. But I learned that, this is very important. I learned that you do not judge human behavior in any way at all, ever, when they're dealing with unfathomable circumstances. No one should judge Sophie's choice. No one should judge what my mother did or didn't do to save her family. No one should judge my great grandfather who was trying to save 100 people in a ditch. And there was a pair of newborn twins and one of them was screaming. And they decided to suffocate that baby,
Mm.
to stifle that child, to keep the other 99 people alive. I mean,
Yeah.
no one should judge the things that people do to survive and to save others because they're unfathomable circumstances. So I learned that. And so my mother was, on the one hand, she was a heroine. She saved her family. She saved her family. On the other hand, someone killed her father right after the liberation. She felt guilty for that. And she was a public speaker. She was a well-known person in her circles. And so, but she was also ashamed. And she was also, so she was supposed to be, she was a heroine. She was a role model for tons of kids, thousands of people. But at the same time, she was small because she was a slut. And so that was something she had to deal with. So these kinds of things were probably the hardest things for me, these kinds of opposites. But I think that's what resilience comes from. I think it comes from those struggles, those tensions that you become aware of, and those tug of wars within that kind of resolve in a way that works out for you.
Yeah.
But I'd say those are probably the hardest things.
That's amazing.
And also the normalcy, the ostensible normalcy, the outside that looks like you're in a house with a white picket fence, you go to school, but inside the terror, the hardest thing is the terror and the grief that is so thick and makes the atmosphere so heavy, but the stories are not told. And when you said earlier that you didn't know if your son could tell that you were having a bad day, these kids they perceive everything. It's like filtered down. They absorb by osmosis. They know if you're not doing well. And if they ask you, that means they're picking up on it.
Yeah.
And, one thing I could say is have respect for the infant. Have respect for their ability to perceive, to know. And it's awesome. If you have awe and respect and reverence, you can't be a bad parent.
Yeah.
And you guys are good parents, right? And because Nugget, he's well-rounded. And, I think you're doing the right things. But I love what you're saying here, Jackie. All of this resonates with me. And wow.
Yeah. You're very inspiring. And I just, the way you can articulate it, I don't know. This has been awesome.
Thank
you. Thank you so much.
We added a new member to the family.
I know. Now I'm invested and I can't wait for the book to get here so I can read it.
Thank you. Well,
awesome.
I blab too much, but I have a lot on my mind about these things. So
no, I love it. I don't think you blabbed at all. This has been so amazing. I love this.
One thing I'll say about my book is that, and I didn't realize this until this woman who's a lawyer and a psychologist. She's a clinical psychologist and a jaded. She's actually has an endowed chair. And she's also suffered with schizophrenia her whole life. She's a genius. And until she wrote this review for me, which is like one of the nicest things anyone's ever said about me, it's incredible, is that one of the things she writes about me is that, and this is what I have to say about the book, because as I said, I never thought about it. She quotes me, but to finish her, not to read the whole thing to you, but this is what she says. She says, Heller does not simply tell us how to navigate the seemingly unnavigable. She doesn't simply show us how to recognize and manage our own demons. Heller travels the path with us. Yesterday Never Sleeps offers hope to those for whom hope seems only a passing shade on their journey through the underworld. What an extraordinary gift Jackie Heller has given us. And that's by Ellen Sachs wrote that. And that was one of the nicest things because I never thought of it that way, but that's what people are feeling, that because everyone wants things that are actionable. Everybody wants, exercises and 10 steps to this and that. I said, I can't write 10 steps to this and that. But my book is more experiential. You learn from reading it because it's one of those books where you read these stories, dozens of stories, and you say, oh my God, that makes me think of this. That makes me think of that. And how does it relate to me? That's what stories are for. Stories are to connect people. And the stories create empathy. Stories create sympathy and make us better people. Without them, we're lost.
Yeah, I agree.
So true. So true.
Thank you so much, Jackie. This has been amazing.
Wow.
And eye contact was great. It's important to have eye contact to be able to connect.
Yeah.
But so is touch, and so is smell, and so is, hearing. I mean, all these things, and they're all getting lost today, which is really sad. So whatever we can do to connect kids to their senses. And so they're not, I don't mean just their thumbs on their phones and on their video games, but because there's a philosopher named Michael Saris who says, this is the thumbelina age. We're going to lose our digits. We're going to have an opposable thumb.
Thumbs.
Yeah. Our DNA is going to change that quickly. We're going to end up with opposable thumbs because that's all we use.
So I will tell you one thing, Jackie, that I think that's really important is it's not just the kids, right? But as adults, we need to become more in tune with ourselves, right? So the other day, I did a little test the other day. I did no social media, no email, no computer, no nothing after I got off work. And I was so in tune with everything that was around me, right? Like I could have a normal conversation with my wife. Even she put down her phone, and we just were like in tune with what was happening at that very moment. And one thing that I learned from a guest we had on early on is that, we want to live for the moment. And so we took that moment. We were able to like grasp onto like so many ideas and things that we've been talking about, that I just felt like in that one moment, like we had resolved like years of like stuff that we've been talking about, and we actually put together a plan. So I think that it's important for adults to, be in tune.
Absolutely. It starts with the adults. We can't start with the kids. We have to start with the parents. This is what I said last week. I did a webinar about how to teach middle school kids about the Holocaust. The answer is you can't teach them the gory historic details, but you can teach them how to become empathetic, how to become sympathetic, and how to not succumb to peer pressure and to social pressure, and how to stand up for themselves. And that starts with the teachers. And I said to the teachers, you're all either a mother or somebody's child. So you can relate to the relationship. It's got to start with you guys. You have to know yourselves. You have to know yourself so that you can create an atmosphere of trust, a nurturing atmosphere of trust where the kids can talk about how they feel. It's not about teaching. It's not a history lesson. It's about a lesson in humanity. And that's where it starts. So I think it's very important that we become very aware of the dangers of disconnection and this whole thing about, this whole epidemic of loneliness that everyone's talking about. It's not just an epidemic of loneliness, it's an epidemic of not knowing how to be alone. There's a difference. The capacity to be alone with yourself is different than loneliness. And there's no separation between the two, but they're entirely different. And the capacity to be alone is being able to sustain yourself from within the richness of your own psyche and your own life history. That's why connection to your history and to your past is important.
Thank you. Thank you, Jackie. I think that's like the perfect ending note.
Yeah.
This has been amazing. I could literally talk to you for hours. Like I'm hooked. I'm hooked.
Anytime.
Thank you.
Can continue anytime. I'm happy to talk.
Awesome.
All right.
Awesome. All right. I'm going to pause audio recording.
Yeah, me too.
I'm so appreciative. I can't thank you enough, Jackie.
Hi, all. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. I'm G-Rex.
And I'm Dirty Skittles.
Don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review this podcast. We'd love to listen to your feedback.
We can't do this without you guys.
It's okay to be not okay. Just make sure you're talking to someone.